Oliver was always the kind of man who seemed to have the entire world perfectly under his control. From a very young age, he possessed a vision that set him apart from his peers. While many simply dreamed of having a comfortable existence, Oliver dreamed of building an empire, something colossal that would bear his name and serve as a beacon of immense pride for his family. It took years of relentless dedication, agonizing choices, and an unimaginable amount of hard work until he finally managed to turn that grand vision into reality. Oliver became the sole owner of one of the most prestigious and highly regarded dermatological clinics in the heart of Miami, Florida. For the vast majority of people, that state-of-the-art clinic was simply a remarkably successful business venture. But for Oliver, it represented something profoundly different. Every pristine corridor, every gleaming treatment room, and every medical breakthrough achieved within those walls served as a testament to the monumental struggles he had faced to reach the absolute pinnacle of his career. In the eyes of society, Oliver was the ultimate self-made man. He resided in a breathtakingly massive mansion located in Coral Gables, one of the most exclusive and affluent neighborhoods in the city, living alongside his aging parents who harbored boundless pride for their son. His mother would often gently hold his hands and say, "My dear son, I am incredibly proud of everything you have built with your own two hands. But please, never forget that the most truly valuable things in this lifetime cannot be purchased with wealth." Oliver would offer a warm, confident smile, but he was a man thoroughly accustomed to resolving any issue that crossed his path. In his mind, there simply was no problem that a combination of extreme effort and substantial financial resources could not fix, especially since his daily reality appeared completely flawless. Standing elegantly by his side was Diana, his stunningly beautiful fiancée, a woman who possessed an extraordinary flair for vanity and high fashion. Diana absolutely adored the glamorous world they inhabited. She lived for the lavish, incredibly expensive vacations to remote islands, the exclusive reservations at the finest five-star restaurants on the coast, the high society galas, and the intoxicating public recognition that naturally came with being on Oliver's arm. On their perfectly curated social media profiles, they appeared to be living out a modern, flawless fairy tale. Everyone who looked at the dazzling couple firmly believed that they were entirely destined for one another, entirely unaware that Oliver's seemingly invincible life was teetering on the edge of a devastating transformation. It all began with incredibly small, easily dismissible warning signs. After an unusually intense, grueling day performing complex procedures at the busy clinic, Oliver arrived at his majestic Coral Gables home feeling a level of exhaustion that went far beyond his normal fatigue. His mother, possessing that innate maternal intuition, noticed the slight droop in his posture the absolute second he walked through the grand mahogany front doors. She approached him with deep concern, etching lines into her face, asking if something terrible had happened, noting that he looked absolutely drained of all his usual vibrant energy. Oliver forced a reassuring smile, gently brushing off her worries by insisting that it was absolutely nothing to be concerned about, claiming he was simply pushing himself a bit too hard at the office. However, as the long days slowly drifted by, that bone-deep exhaustion stubbornly refused to leave his body. Soon after, incredibly strange things began to happen that he simply could not rationally explain away. A sudden, terrifying weakness would randomly grip his legs, making the simple act of climbing the sweeping, curved staircase of his own luxurious home feel like scaling a massive mountain. Standing on his feet for extended periods of time, a completely normal requirement for his profession, suddenly morphed into a monumental physical challenge. The powerful, commanding man who regularly spent countless hours, flawlessly leading extensive medical meetings and performing precise treatments now desperately, needed to sit down just to finish a standard conversation with his medical staff. The final breaking point occurred one entirely ordinary afternoon, right in the middle of his bustling clinic. Oliver suddenly lost his physical equilibrium, stumbling forward and nearly collapsing onto the polished marble floor. In that precise, terrifying fraction of a second, He finally realized that this was not merely the result of working far too many hours. Something within his own body was fundamentally and horribly wrong. After enduring countless, exhausting rounds of intrusive medical examinations and waiting through days of agonizing uncertainty, the final diagnosis was delivered. A devastatingly rare neurological disease was aggressively attacking his nervous system, severely impairing his motor functions and basic movements. The team of top-tier medical specialists somberly explained that he would immediately require intense, continuous medical supervision, incredibly aggressive medical treatments, and countless, grueling sessions of specialized physical therapy. They made it absolutely, painfully clear that this would not be a fast or simple recovery process. Oliver was going to have to learn how to fight an entirely different kind of war. The powerful entrepreneur, who had spent his entire adult life firmly gripping the steering wheel of his destiny, was now violently forced to accept the agonizing reality that he could no longer even control the basic functions of his own physical body. In the very beginning of this devastating ordeal, Diana firmly remained by his side. She dutifully accompanied him to the endless, depressing medical consultations, tightly holding his shaking hand and softly promising that she would remain steadfastly beside him, vowing that they would undoubtedly conquer this terrible obstacle together. Oliver, desperately wanting to hold on to his crumbling world, wholeheartedly believed her words. But as the agonizing months slowly dragged on, the vibrant rhythm of their shared life drastically altered. The spontaneous, luxurious weekend getaways on private jets completely ceased to exist. The glamorous, champagne-filled society parties became a distant memory. Their romantic, late-night dinners at ridiculously expensive oceanfront restaurants were swiftly and permanently replaced by sterile, exhausting evening sessions of intensive physical therapy. Gradually, Diana began to acutely feel the profound absence of not just those luxurious places, but of the glamorous, high-speed lifestyle that Oliver had so effortlessly provided for her. Oliver, despite his physical decline, was still a highly observant man, and he slowly began to perceive an incredibly painful, undeniable truth unfolding right in front of his eyes. He realized that perhaps some people in this world are far more in love with the beautiful, effortless moments they get to experience beside you, rather than actually being deeply in love with the person you truly are. As the long, difficult months continued to pass, the daily atmosphere inside that colossal Coral Gables mansion morphed into something unrecognizable. The spectacular home that had previously echoed with the joyful sounds of visiting friends, booming laughter, and excited chatter about upcoming European vacations now harbored a distinctly different, heavy sound, complete and absolute silence. Oliver spent his agonizingly slow days trapped in an endless, repetitive cycle between somber medical consultations, exhausting physical therapy, and desperate, tear-filled attempts to force his uncooperative muscles to regain their former movements. He stubbornly continued fighting with every ounce of his remaining willpower, but it was becoming entirely impossible to deny the tragic reality of his situation. His once strong body simply no longer responded the way it used to. The incredibly dynamic man who once commanded total respect simply by walking into a crowded room, causing people to eagerly stand up just to hear his brilliant ideas, now humiliatingly required the physical support of others just to walk a few short meters across his own bedroom, and this harsh reality mercilessly crushed his immense pride. Deep down in his battered heart, however, Oliver foolishly clung to the belief that he still had Diana's love, until the glaring signs of her internal shift became impossible to ignore. Diana began spending hours obsessively scrolling through old digital photo albums, staring longingly at captured moments of past European trips, extravagant parties, and exclusive charity events. She was drowning in the sorrow of missing that vibrant life, while Oliver found himself quietly celebrating incredibly small, hard-won victories during his grueling physical therapy sessions with Marcus, his dedicated therapist. Diana could only focus her mind on everything the disease had stolen from her personal social calendar. One particularly quiet evening, Oliver noticed her sitting completely detached on the velvet sofa, staring blankly out the window. He softly mentioned that she barely spoke to him anymore. She let out a long, dramatic sigh and replied that she was just incredibly tired. But Oliver knew deep down that it was not physical exhaustion. It was profound regret. Several days later, the final blow was delivered when he accidentally overheard her having a hushed, frantic conversation on her cell phone with her socialite friend, Beatrice. Diana was crying, bitterly complaining that her entire existence had devolved into managing medications, attending depressing doctor appointments, and watching physical therapy. She confessed that she desperately missed the carefree, glamorous woman she used to be. That specific, devastating sentence completely shattered Oliver's spirit, because for the absolute first time, he fully understood the grim reality of his relationship. Diana did not actually miss him as a human being. She exclusively missed the extravagant life he had given her. Shortly after that phone call, she finally made the cowardly decision to walk away. As she was hastily packing her expensive designer suitcases in their massive bedroom, Oliver stared at her from his wheelchair and quietly asked if this was really the end, questioning if she had truly only loved him during the absolute best and easiest phase of his life. Tears streamed down her meticulously made-up face as she offered a pathetic excuse, claiming she had honestly tried her best, but she simply could not bear to live a completely stagnant life, constantly waiting in the shadows for him to miraculously turn back into the powerful man he once was. That specific phrase profoundly altered his entire worldview, plunging him into a dark abyss, because Oliver suddenly realized that he might never actually become that man ever again. Following her abrupt departure, he completely shut down his emotional world. He strictly refused to receive any visiting friends. He absolutely barred any of his loyal clinical staff from coming to the house. And he pushed away everyone who cared. The enormous mansion began to feel hauntingly empty and cold. His desperate, heartbroken parents tried absolutely everything to help, taking the initiative to hire highly qualified private nurses to assist with his daily care, but absolutely none of them managed to stay. He aggressively fired the first nurse, he insulted the second one until she quit, and the third simply gave up, creating a disastrous cycle that continued until a total of 8 different nurses had come and gone. All of them reported the exact same issue. He was impossibly cruel and absolutely refused to let anyone get emotionally or physically close to him. Oliver began to deeply believe that his toxic mindset was entirely correct. Nobody was ever going to stay. That is, until the fateful day his parents desperately hired a brand new nurse named Chloe. When Chloe confidently stepped through the grand doorway of that sprawling mansion for the very first time, Oliver glared at her from across the vast room and cynically thought to himself that she was just going to be another weak person who would inevitably pack her bags and run away. However, he had absolutely no idea that this particular woman would be the very first person stepping into his home who was completely and utterly uninterested in the millionaire version of Oliver. She was uniquely determined to discover and care for the broken, vulnerable Oliver, whom the rest of the superficial world had so easily abandoned. The moment Chloe approached the threshold of his darkened, gloomy bedroom, she was already well aware that this assignment was not going to be a simple walk in the park. Even before she had the chance to actually meet Oliver face to face, his anxious parents had thoroughly briefed her regarding the disastrous experiences with the previous caregivers. A total of 8 highly trained medical professionals had walked through that very house, and absolutely 0 of them had possessed the emotional fortitude to remain. Oliver's weeping mother had grasped Chloe's hands and warned her, explaining through heavy tears that her son used to be completely different. He used to be a joyous man overflowing with grand dreams, but after the devastating illness struck, it appeared as though he had entirely given up on his own existence. Chloe had looked deeply into the eyes of that suffering mother, feeling a profound sense of empathy, and gently replied that sometimes in life, the individuals who act the most incredibly difficult are actually the exact same people who most desperately need someone to stubbornly refuse to leave them. Armed with that profound philosophy, she finally pushed open the heavy oak door and entered his sanctuary. Oliver was lying perfectly still on his large bed, his eyes fixed blankly on the window, wearing that deeply entrenched, icy expression that had sadly become his permanent shield against the outside world. He gruffly stated that she must be the newest victim hired to play the role of his nurse. Chloe did not flinch. Instead, she offered a warm, genuine smile, brightly introducing herself and politely expressing that it was a genuine pleasure to meet him. He immediately fired back, without making even the slightest attempt to be polite or welcoming, harshly advising her not to bother memorizing any specific details about his medical routine, because she certainly was not going to stick around long, enough for it to matter. Chloe feigned a look of mild surprise, but unlike the previous 8 women who had stormed out in tears, she simply refused to take his bitter bait or feel personally offended. She calmly observed aloud that he clearly had a deeply ingrained habit of greeting new people by immediately trying to forcefully push them away. Oliver maintained his deadpan, serious glare and bluntly confirmed that his harsh method almost always worked perfectly. Chloe let out a soft, melodic chuckle, a sound that felt incredibly out of place in that depressing room, and confidently retorted that she strongly suspected his little trick was not going to work on her today. For the absolute first time in what felt like an eternity, Oliver was confronted with a human being who did not cower in fear at his terrible attitude. The initial few days of their professional relationship were an absolute, undeniable war of wills. Oliver stubbornly refused her gentle offers of assistance. He completely rejected any attempts at casual conversation, and he restricted his verbal responses to the absolute bare minimum required for his survival. Every single morning, Chloe would deliberately bounce into the room, radiating positive energy, cheerfully wishing him a good morning. He would inevitably scowl and mutter darkly that there was absolutely nothing good about his current reality. But Chloe possessed a sharp, intuitive mind, and she quickly realized a fundamental truth about her difficult patient. Oliver was not inherently a cruel or malicious person. He was simply a profoundly wounded man, desperately trying to build an impenetrable fortress around his shattered heart to protect himself from further abandonment. One particularly beautiful Florida morning, she boldly marched into his room and forcefully yanked open the heavy, blackout curtains, allowing a massive flood of brilliant golden sunlight to instantly illuminate the dark space. Oliver instantly recoiled from the brightness, angrily demanding to know what on earth she thought she was doing. Chloe casually smoothed out her uniform and simply replied that she was deliberately letting a little bit of actual life back into his gloomy cave. He fiercely argued back, insisting that the house was perfectly fine exactly the way it was in the dark. Chloe slowly looked around the massive, silent room, taking in the expensive but lifeless decor, and firmly shook her head. She softly but directly told him that the beautiful house felt exactly as though time had completely stopped moving forward on the precise day that he had allowed profound sadness to swallow him whole. That brutally honest observation deeply unsettled Oliver, gnawing at his conscience for the rest of the day, primarily because he knew deep down in his soul that her assessment was entirely and undeniably true. Following that pivotal morning, when Chloe fearlessly threw open the heavy curtains of his self-imposed prison, a subtle but undeniable shift began to slowly take root within the walls of the mansion. Oliver vehemently denied that anything was changing within himself, constantly maintaining his gruff exterior and continuing to offer incredibly brief, slightly grumpy responses. However, Chloe's sharp eyes caught onto a very crucial detail. He had entirely stopped demanding that she pack her bags and leave. For a deeply stubborn man who had systematically terrorized and banished 8 highly qualified nurses, this silent acceptance was an absolutely massive, monumental victory. Every single morning, without fail, Chloe would gracefully step into his bedroom wearing that exact same bright, unwavering smile, cheerfully wishing him a good morning. Oliver would usually roll his eyes and sarcastically ask if she had grown tired of constantly pretending that his bedroom was some sort of joyful, happy paradise. Chloe would naturally let out a warm, genuine laugh, shaking her head and explaining that she was not pretending at all. She was simply doing her very best to gently remind him that an entire beautiful world full of life still existed right outside his window. Oliver would typically turn his head sharply away to stare at the wall, but he was secretly trying to hide the tiny, involuntary smile that tugged at the corners of his mouth, a subtle reaction that Chloe absolutely never failed to notice. One particular afternoon, she arrived for her shift carrying something noticeably different. A beautifully wrapped, incredibly small cardboard box resting delicately in her hands. Oliver narrowed his eyes in deep suspicion, gruffly demanding to know what she was holding. She brightly announced that it was a simple gift. His facial expression instantly darkened into a severe scowl, and he harshly reminded her that she was an employee who was paid to be there, firmly stating that she absolutely did not need to waste her time trying to superficially flatter him. Chloe remained completely unfazed by his sharp tone. She calmly walked over and gently placed the little box on the bedside table right next to him, playfully teasing him to calm down and revealing that it was merely a small box of premium chocolate truffles. Oliver stared at the innocent box for a long time, his voice dropping to a heavy, quiet whisper as he confessed that he honestly could not even recall the very last time another human being had given him something purely out of kindness without secretly expecting some massive favor or financial reward in return. Chloe's usual bright demeanor instantly turned deeply serious because that incredibly brief, heartbreaking sentence inadvertently exposed a psychological wound that was vastly deeper and more painful than his physical illness. She looked directly into his eyes and softly replied that it was high time he started getting accustomed to genuine kindness again. As the weeks slowly blended into months, Chloe steadily began to uncover the true, vibrant personality of the real Oliver buried beneath the bitterness. Through Elena, the longtime housekeeper, she discovered that Oliver possessed a deep, hidden passion for classic, vintage literature. Armed with this new knowledge, Chloe began bringing beautifully bound, classic novels into his room. In the very beginning, she would casually sit in the corner and read the stories out loud, seemingly to herself. Oliver would stubbornly cross his arms and completely pretend that he was not paying any attention whatsoever to her voice. But without fail, the exact second she paused her reading to take a sip of water or turn a page, he would instantly become impatient and gruffly demand to know what happened next in the plot. Chloe would hide a victorious smile, innocently stating that she had fully assumed he was completely ignoring her. He would suddenly look incredibly awkward, hastily muttering an excuse that he was merely trying to pass the incredibly boring time. But deep down, both of them were entirely aware that it was a blatant lie. Slowly but surely, the massive Coral Gables mansion began to resurrect. The previously silent hallways were once again filled with the beautiful sounds of television shows, spontaneous bursts of laughter, engaging conversations, and actual, breathing life. The household staff, including the usually stoic gardeners, began to visibly notice the miraculous transformation, as did Oliver's deeply relieved parents. His mother would frequently stand near the massive bay windows, crying tears of profound joy as she watched from a distance while her son genuinely smiled and laughed with Chloe out in the blooming garden, a breathtaking sight she had not witnessed in many long, agonizing months. And it was not exclusively Oliver's wounded heart that was undergoing a miraculous transformation. His physical body was remarkably responding as well. The grueling physical therapy sessions with Marcus began yielding incredibly tangible results. He was making very small, extremely painful, but absolutely monumental steps forward. On the monumental day that Oliver finally managed to independently walk a significantly longer distance across the lush green grass of the garden, Chloe cheered and clapped her hands with such explosive joy that it seemed as though the personal victory was entirely her own. She rushed over, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and proudly declared that she always knew he had the inner strength to achieve it. Oliver paused, leaning heavily on his walker, and looked deeply into her eyes. In that profoundly quiet moment, a massive realization washed over him. For so many agonizing months, he had pathetically waited for the glamorous Diana to walk back through his front door, But the phenomenal woman who had actually rolled up her sleeves and stayed in the trenches by his side was Chloe. Deep, powerful romantic feelings were rapidly beginning to bloom between them, yet neither of them possessed the sheer courage to verbalize their emotions. Chloe was utterly terrified of crossing a professional boundary. She was merely the hired nurse, and he was her incredibly wealthy patient. Oliver, on the other hand, was absolutely paralyzed by the terrifying fear of finally allowing himself to deeply love someone again, only to be completely abandoned once more. Eventually, during a beautifully quiet evening, while they were sitting closely together on the expansive, breezy back porch, the silence was finally broken. Oliver looked at the fading sunset and quietly asked if she wanted to know the absolute worst, most agonizing part of losing his physical mobility. Chloe gently leaned forward, her voice a soft whisper, and asked him to share it with her. He turned his head, locking his gaze with hers, and confessed that the greatest tragedy was realizing that certain people only have the capacity to love you when you are completely healthy, successful, and incredibly easy to love. Chloe struggled to hold back a wave of intense emotion, her voice trembling slightly as she wisely replied that if that was the case, then those people never truly experienced real love in the first place. That incredibly profound statement firmly cemented itself in his mind forever, because for the absolute first time in his entire existence, Oliver felt completely confident that someone was truly seeing him. She was not looking at the wealthy entrepreneur. She was not looking at the massive bank accounts. She was finally looking directly at his soul, while Oliver was beautifully and steadily beginning the arduous process of completely rebuilding his shattered life and opening his heavily guarded heart. The toxic ghosts of his previous life rudely decided to make an unexpected return. It all started entirely by accident when Oliver's mother, Olivia, was happily shopping in an upscale boutique and unexpectedly ran into Beatrice, the well-known socialite, who also happened to be Diana's incredibly close, gossiping friend. Completely overjoyed and overflowing with maternal relief, Olivia innocently commented that her beloved son was practically a brand new man. She enthusiastically shared that ever since his wonderful new nurse, Chloe, had arrived at the estate, it honestly seemed as though Oliver had completely returned to the land of the living. She even warmly speculated that a remarkably beautiful, genuine romance was quietly blooming between the two of them. Naturally, this incredibly juicy piece of information traveled at lightning speed and directly reached Diana's eager ears, and she found herself completely unable to swallow the bitter pill of reality. In her arrogant, deeply selfish mind, she had always firmly assumed that Oliver would spend the rest of his miserable life pitifully waiting in the shadows for her glorious return. She possessed absolutely zero desire to undertake the difficult task of physically caring for a recovering invalid, but her massive, fragile ego absolutely refused to accept the thought of another woman happily occupying her former, highly coveted throne inside that luxurious Coral Gables mansion. Driven entirely by burning jealousy and a desperate need to reclaim her lost status, Diana abruptly decided to aggressively force her way back into his life. And she cruelly chose to return, utilizing the absolute most destructive, manipulative lie imaginable, a lie specifically designed to entirely obliterate his newfound happiness. She suddenly appeared completely unannounced at the massive front gates of the mansion one sunny afternoon. Oliver was sitting in the living room, and upon seeing her dramatically walk through the door, he was left entirely speechless and frozen in total shock. He fiercely demanded to know what on earth she thought she was doing trespassing in his home. Diana immediately put on a theatrical performance, delicately placing her manicured hand over her perfectly flat stomach, and released a fake, trembling sob. She looked him dead in the eyes and completely fabricated a story, claiming that she simply could not keep the massive secret hidden any longer. She boldly announced that she was pregnant with his child. In that exact, horrifying fraction of a second, the beautiful, delicate foundation of trust and budding love that Oliver and Chloe had been painstakingly building together over the past few months was suddenly, violently threatened with total destruction. When Diana forcefully injected her toxic presence back into the quiet sanctuary of that mansion, Oliver felt a sickening wave of nausea, as if the darkest, most painful chapter of his past had physically resurrected itself to torture him. For many long, lonely months after she had initially abandoned him, he had foolishly, desperately prayed for exactly this moment to occur. He had waited for her to come crawling back, begging for forgiveness and tearfully admitting that walking away was the biggest mistake of her life. But now that she was actually standing right in front of him, the entire situation felt completely wrong, primarily because the shattered heart she had so carelessly tossed aside was no longer empty or available. Chloe had softly, quietly, and completely healed those broken pieces. She had entered his dark world without demanding expensive gifts, without expecting luxurious vacations, and simply remained steadfastly anchored by his side when the rest of the superficial world had sprinted for the exit. The catastrophic news of the supposed pregnancy detonated like a massive explosive device within the previously peaceful walls of the household. Oliver's elderly parents were completely bewildered and thrown into a state of immense anxiety. Meanwhile, Chloe felt her entire world violently crash down around her. She desperately tried to maintain a brave face, forcing a tight, unconvincing smile and pretending that she was perfectly fine with this new, devastating reality. But deep inside her chest, she felt her own heart physically aching and breaking into a million tiny pieces. She was entirely aware that Oliver was fundamentally an incredibly honorable, deeply responsible human being, and she knew without a shadow of a doubt that a good man like him would absolutely never, under any circumstances, abandon his own flesh and blood. Over the course of the following agonizing days, the entire dynamic of the household drastically and uncomfortably shifted. Diana arrogantly began to frequent the grand mansion on a daily basis, confidently strutting down the hallways and obnoxiously attempting to behave exactly as though she had never cruelly abandoned him in his darkest hour. She incessantly chattered about lavish future plans, completely redesigning the nursery, and fully moving her extensive wardrobe back into the master bedroom. However, she was completely blind to one incredibly vital, undeniable reality: the incredibly vulnerable, dependent Oliver that she had callously left behind several months ago simply ceased to exist. In the past, the old Oliver aggressively required highly exclusive, incredibly expensive social events and public validation just to crack a genuine smile. Now, the completely transformed Oliver found immense, profound joy in a simple, quiet conversation about literature while sitting next to a blooming flower bed. In his previous life, he foolishly believed that true love was defined by someone happily standing next to you while you were popping champagne on a luxury yacht. Chloe had effectively completely rewritten his definition of love, teaching him through her quiet actions that absolute, genuine love boldly reveals itself during the absolute darkest, most terrifying storms of your life. Despite Diana's aggressive, constant physical presence in the room, and despite her loudly waving the flag of her supposed pregnancy, she began to infuriatingly notice that Oliver's completely distracted gaze was constantly, desperately searching the room for someone else entirely: Chloe. And Chloe, despite desperately trying to maintain a professional distance, clearly noticed it too. She vividly saw how incredibly tortured and fiercely divided Oliver was feeling. She profoundly witnessed exactly how much this chaotic, messy situation was emotionally destroying every single person involved. Confronted with this agonizing reality, Chloe finally made the absolute most difficult, heartbreaking decision she had ever faced in her entire existence. When the bright Florida sun rose the very next morning, Oliver eagerly woke up, genuinely expecting to hear the cheerful, melodic voice that had miraculously transformed his previously miserable days. He waited for her standard, playful greeting, but for the absolute first time in many long healing months, the large bedroom remained completely engulfed in a deafening, heavy silence. Chloe simply never walked through the oak door. In her usual place beside his medication tray, there was absolutely nothing except a neatly folded, handwritten letter resting quietly on the polished wood. Oliver quickly snatched the white paper, his hands uncontrollably trembling with dread, and slowly began to read the ink on the page. The letter began with her familiar warmth, gently stating that when she first accepted the difficult assignment at his home, she fully believed her sole professional duty would be to physically rehabilitate his ailing body. However, he wrote, she quickly discovered that there were incredibly deep, invisible emotional wounds that absolutely no pharmaceutical medication could ever hope to cure. She confessed that she had found a severely broken man who had tragically lost vastly more than just his physical mobility. He had entirely lost his inner will to believe in the goodness of humanity. She beautifully noted that witnessing his genuine, bright smile slowly return had easily become the absolute greatest, most rewarding achievement of her entire life. However, the tone of the letter then shifted into a heavy sadness. Chloe explicitly stated that she genuinely felt she had completely fulfilled her professional duty. He was physically vastly stronger, he was bravely walking on his own 2 feet again, and he was finally embracing life. But, she noted, there was now a vastly different, highly complicated personal situation that he desperately needed to handle. She explained that Diana's sudden, shocking return carrying his supposed child had changed the entire landscape of his future, and Chloe honestly felt that her lingering presence in the mansion was selfishly causing far more emotional chaos than actual healing. Because she loved him too much to complicate his duty to his child, she had officially submitted her permanent resignation. She politely informed him that he was completely free to hire a different medical professional if he felt it was necessary. She ended the heartbreaking letter by deeply thanking him for bravely allowing her to discover the incredibly wonderful, genuine Oliver, not the wealthy Miami entrepreneur, not the famous clinic owner, but simply the beautiful soul hiding underneath. She signed it with profound affection. When Oliver finally finished reading the final sentence, he sat completely frozen in absolute silence, and for the very first time, the entire situation became crystal clear in his mind. Diana had only desperately rushed back into his life, precisely because she saw that he was successfully rising from the ashes and regaining his former glory. Conversely, Chloe had packed her bags and walked away, despite the absolute fact that she was deeply in love with him, purely because her only genuine desire was to see him live a peaceful, uncomplicated life. In that exact defining moment, Oliver felt a massive surge of absolute certainty. He swore to himself that he absolutely could not allow the only pure-hearted person who had steadfastly remained by his side when he had absolutely nothing superficial to offer to simply walk out of his life forever. He remained entirely motionless on his bed for a very long time, tightly gripping Chloe's heartfelt letter in his shaking hands. He obsessively reread every single beautiful word multiple times, and with every single pass, one specific truth became increasingly undeniable. Chloe had absolutely never aggressively attempted to steal anyone else's place in his life. She had naturally, beautifully filled a void simply by stubbornly refusing to leave him alone in the dark when he needed a friend the most. A massive flood of incredibly vivid, beautiful memories suddenly washed over him. He remembered the very first, hostile day she walked into his room and he viciously tried to verbally destroy her. He remembered the incredibly sweet, simple chocolate truffles she had kindly purchased for him, completely well aware that he was stubbornly pretending to hate them. He warmly recalled the countless peaceful afternoons spent sitting under the Florida sun while she read classic literature to him, and the incredibly monumental day he finally managed to take his first unassisted steps, turning around to see her crying tears of absolute joy as if his physical triumph was her own personal victory. As Oliver read Chloe's heartfelt letter, he was struck by the terrifying possibility of losing the woman who had helped rebuild his life. Meanwhile, Diana confidently believed her plan had succeeded and began talking about luxury trips, expensive purchases, and social events as if everything had returned to normal. However, Oliver was no longer the same man. His suspicions grew when Diana avoided every discussion about her supposed pregnancy. The truth was finally revealed when he overheard her admitting that the pregnancy was designed to secure her position and prevent him from giving his fortune to Chloe. Realizing she had abandoned him during his darkest days and returned only when she saw him finding happiness again, Oliver calmly confronted her. Feeling only disappointment rather than anger, he ended their relationship and had her permanently removed from the estate. Knowing exactly where he belonged, Oliver traveled on his own to Chloe's apartment. When she opened the door and saw him standing there without a cane or wheelchair, she was overwhelmed with emotion. Oliver thanked her for doing far more than helping him recover physically. She had saved him from the bitterness and despair that had consumed his heart. Chloe gently reminded him that she had simply helped him rediscover the good man he had always been. Their reunion marked the beginning of a new chapter built on honesty, gratitude, and genuine love rather than appearances or wealth. After returning to lead his Miami clinic, Oliver approached life with a completely different perspective. No longer obsessed with status, success, or outward appearances, he understood the true value of people who remain loyal during life's hardest struggles. Chloe, who had entered his mansion as an employee, became the greatest love of his life because she stayed beside him when everything else was falling apart. Their story proved that real love is not measured during moments of success and comfort, but during times of pain and uncertainty. While many people disappear when hardship arrives, those who remain, offering support, loyalty, and compassion, are life's most precious treasure.